This series is all about universes, multiverses, planets, worlds, continents and cities. We're delving not into specific games, but into the milieus created for them. We'll be looking at where these settings came from, their major features, and why you should consider them for your own gaming experiences. Here we are at episode 10. This time around, and I'll do this for a small handful of worlds as we go, I'm going to cover part of a setting. The reason for doing this is because some larger settings have components that were originally released as separate milieus within the same world. This is the case with today's setting, the world of Krynn, of DragonLance fame. In this video, I'll be discussing the continent of Ansalon. The other major setting within Krynn, Taladas, I'll delve into at a later time. Back in 1983, the Dungeons & Dragons game was approaching its 10th birthday and was going stronger than ever. The old digest-sized books of 1974 had been replaced by robust hardcovers in the form of the Advanced game, and new sets of its sister game with glossy rebranding had started production with the revised basic set, the start of what would become the BCMI or BECMI line. Tracy and Laura Hickman were in at TSR, already with strong releases under their belts for the D&D games, including Rahazia, Pharaoh, and the original version of the ever-recycled Ravenloft. The ingredients for something new and shiny were there. All it needed was a spark. That spark was, as it turned out, one of those simple observations that, when they occur, everyone wonders why it hadn't been made before. And that was, for a game called Dungeons & Dragons, there were plenty of dungeons in official releases, but very few dragons. That's not to say that D&D material was devoid of dragons. They were all over the artwork for the game and appeared as monsters in several adventure modules up to that point. There are several within the Giant series, notably white dragons within the glacial rift of the Frost Giant Jarl, and a red dragon in the depths of the Fire Giant halls. A dragon haunts a major drow enclave in descent into the depths of the earth. A blue dragon haunts the mountains on the way to the lost caverns of Sojkanth. Strahd's famous castle even houses a couple. But although giants, drow, elementals, demiliches, vampires, fungi and a plethora of humanoids have received adventures focusing on them, it seemed as if dragons were doomed to guest cameos within the game that bore their very name in its titling. That was about to change. The RPG world was about to be introduced to Krynn, Ansalon, and the mighty DragonLances. Before we get into that, though, I'd like to touch on an aspect of D&D that might not be so obvious to today's gamer. What with the plethora of monsters and variants spread across multiple volumes, both official and third-party. You see, with the concept of character levels comes the concept of ever-increasing challenge, which often means ever-increasing power levels for monstrous foes. The early editions of D&D had this baked in across many of the core monster types. Humanoids are the most obvious, with a progression that goes kobolds, goblins, hobgoblins, orcs, gnolls, bugbears and ogres. Giants too, from hill to storm, and lycanthropes from the humble were-rat to the mighty were-tiger. All of this progression of power level tied into the whole concept of characters levelling up to face greater foes. And before you say, but ogres are giants, it really doesn't matter if you tag them on as the powerful end of the humanoid scale or the low end of the giants. They work as both, and it's only really since 3rd edition that defined types have come into use. The 1st edition monster manual has them hanging out with both orcs and trolls, and places no specific categorization on them as being giants. In mythology, ogres are traditionally large, ugly, man-like cannibals, but anyway, you see the point. Monster types have some form of levels too. And so it is with dragons. Within D&D, the dragons have a definitive order of power. White, black, green, blue, red for chromatic, and brass, copper, bronze, silver, gold for metallics. It isn't a great leap, therefore, for someone saying, we need to have something with greater focus on dragons, to let's do a series of adventures that scale by dragon type. And so this is what happened, sort of. The series jumps around a bit, but the broad concept of escalation is there. Tracy and Laura Hickman were set to designing the world for this dragon-focused series, and a number of authors and artists were drafted in to add flesh to the whole thing. The crafters of the original Dragonlance game materials reads like a who's who of mid-1980s TSR fame. Doug Niles, Harold Johnson, Bruce Nesmith, Jeff Grubb, Bruce Hurd, Mike Briot, Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley. All names anyone playing D&D during that era of role-playing should be well find familiar. The result was a campaign comprising 14 adventure modules, including source material, battle system scenarios, and a war game along the way, released over a period of 3 years, from 1984 to 1986. Further releases followed to capitalise on the huge popularity of the series, 1987's hardback Dragonlance Adventures and the Atlas of the Dragonlance World by the divine Karen Wynne Fonstad, and 1988's Mists of Krynn, a compilation of short adventures, and World of Krynn, a further sourcebook on the setting. Each of the original 14 adventures, 12 if we ignore the 5th, which is Dragons of Mystery, as it is a sourcebook, and the 11th, Dragons of Glory, as it is a wargame, focuses on a particular dragon foe. In Dragons of Despair, black. Red in Dragons of Flame, Dragons of Hope, which also features a brass dragon, and Dragons of Desolation, which also features a gold. White in Dragons of Ice and Dragons of Light, along with silver. Blue in Dragons of War. A whole gaggle of colours in metals in Dragons of Deceit. Green in Dragons of Dream. Blue, Bronze and Sea dragons in Dragons of Faith. And all of the dragons in Dragons of Truth and Dragons of Triumph, including a guest appearance by Takesis. So, yes, it doesn't strictly follow the power hierarchy of dragons, but that does underpin some of the structural elements of the series. Now let's touch on novels. Alongside all of this multi-module narrative adventure fest, TSR released a trilogy of novels, the DragonLance Chronicles. In order, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter Night, and Dragons of Spring Dawning, all written by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss. These were published originally over 1984 and 1985, meaning that all of the initial trilogy was out before the entire module saga had been completed. The novels were a relatively new concept in gaming, especially ones that tied in so closely to the game and adventures, but it worked. The books were bestsellers and spawned a continuation of novels that, to date, over 160 volumes have been published. But going back to the original trilogy, its popularity, combined with the popularity of the adventures, was both a blessing and a curse. You see, part of the structure of the adventures follows the novels. The first 4, Despair, Flame, Hope and Desolation, follow the narrative of Dragons of Autumn Twilight fairly closely. If you read the novel, and many had, the adventures held little surprise for you, although the 3rd and 4th adventures are not detailed within the novel itself. Adventures 6 through 12 cross with Dragons of Winter Night, while 12 through 14 cross with Dragons of Spring Dawning. The saving grace for these latter sections is that the adventures detail parts of the novel's narrative that are merely summarised, usually as we pick up back with one group of characters or another after they have completed a mission that is detailed in the adventure. This makes the whole series a heady mix of we know what's coming and we have no idea what's going on here for players that are familiar with the novels. The novels are also problematic in that they set players' expectations. The modules promote use of the same characters as appear within the novels, and from there it becomes a festival of players picking their favourite from the novels and expecting things to pan out in the same way, as if they were playing through the novels rather than ostensibly the parallel universe mapped out by the adventures. This could be broken somewhat by having players use their own creations, and that is absolutely the way I'd recommend people use them. It's also unfortunate that players that choose to pick Tasselhoff, a halfling, Kenda, or who opt to play their own Kenda, who then tends to default to Tasselhoff-esque personality, always trend towards the annoying. Anyway, point being, having the novels and adventures so closely tied was painful for those of us that were more used to the freeform structure of D&D modules to date. The massive railroading features of the modules didn't help either, with rules for obscure deaths for important NPCs written into the fabric of the narrative, which, I feel, robs players of hard-won victories. Enough of that tirade. DragonLance proved to be very popular, novels and adventures both, and from that day forth, TSR went down a similar path, although not quite as encapsulated, for the Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms settings, and all of those settings that were to come with the advent of 2nd edition. DragonLance continued into the 2nd edition era with an attempt at a new focus, the continent of Taladas, which we will recover in a different video. Ansalon was still here though, and from 1990 to 1994, the original 14 modules, with the sourcebooks and standalone wargame removed, compiled into 3 volumes as DragonLance Classics, and an attempted relaunch of the world as a campaign base with the Tales of the Lance box set. Although a handful of additional adventures were released set on Ansalon, the DQ and DS series for example, including Flint's Axe and New Beginnings, the world just kept getting dragged back to the War of the Lance and those 14 adventures that made it so popular to start with. In 1996, Kryn was moved over to the Saga game system and tied to the Dragons of a New Age trilogy. By 1998, Saga was more or less over and done with, and a handful of adventures came out that were dual system, covering both 2nd edition AD&D and Saga system rules. And then, in 1999, the inevitable return to the War of the Lance occurred with the release of the 15th anniversary refactoring of the original 14 modules, representing the tale for the 4th time. Once 3rd edition D&D had established itself, Margaret Weis's own D20 third-party company picked up the rights to publish Dragonlance materials from Wizards of the Coast. This resulted in the Dragonlance campaign setting and some supporting material. Some notable sourcebooks include the period setting overviews, Age of Mortals covering the period up to the War of the Lance, and War of the Lance itself, and Legend of the Twins, describing time travel and a number of points within Ansalon's history. Various groups and organisations received their own books: Towers of High Sorcery, Holy Order of Stars, Knightly Orders, Races and Dragons, and the Age of Mortals received its own trilogy of adventures. From 2003 to 2007, we got to see a different side to Kryn, beyond the War of the Lance. But of course, it being something that overshadows Ansalon in much the same way as Castle Ravenloft broods over the entirety of the Demiplane of Dread, the inevitable return to the war came in 2007. Dragons of Autumn, Dragons of Winter, and Dragons of Spring formed a trilogy of adventures that followed the plot of those old 14 now familiar adventures. It should be noted at this point that the Dragonlance novels continued throughout. So, while I may appear to be, and actually am, painting a picture of Ansalon in terms of a game setting that cannot escape its base origin, doomed to recycle the same period of its existence, the novels do a much better job at driving the setting forward. They still prove popular and look to continue regardless of any blips and legal wranglings that might have occurred between the licence holders and the world's creators and primary authors. And the less said about that, the better. In 2022, the D&D game returned to Ansalon after a pause of 14 years, with the 5th edition adventure Shadow of the Dragon Queen. While this is another return to the War of the Lance period, thus proving the setting as a game world is still finding it virtually impossible to escape the critical mass of its wild early popularity, this book at least tries to do something different. Instead of reiterating the journeys of the heroes of the Lance, the adventure focuses on the goings-on in the region of Calaman. Same war, different story. In that, I feel it had a good idea. Stick to the familiar territory of the war while still exploring a hitherto unfamiliar part of it. However, in true 5th edition style, and see my Spelljammer overview for more on this, it did steamroller over many of the unique aspects that make Dragonlance a world that it isn't the Forgotten Realms. It's also in that established narrative, encounter-by-encounter plot point format common across 5th edition adventures, so there is that too. In 2023, we can say that Dragonlance, or specifically the Ansalon portion of Kryn, is alive. Not badly so within the novels, but decisively on life support as a game setting. As far as game settings go, Ansalon doesn't have much in the way of deep roots. It was generally created for a specific purpose. That is, to produce a series of adventures featuring dragons, and much of the foundational lore revolves around providing a backdrop for that purpose. Although at this point the setting is some 40 years old, it doesn't have the homogeneous growth through active gaming that the likes of Greyhawk and the Forgotten Realms and Glorantha and others that have or will appear in this series. That being said, the lore that it does have is consistent, ignoring some of the hand-waving of it in Shadows of the Dragon Queen, and solid. On the surface, it feels like a D&D setting in much the same way as Greyhawk, the Realms and Mystara do, but it adds those twists of difference that defines it as its own thing. Wizards tied to the phases of the moons, the structured Knights of Solamnia, and, in particular, the place the world's deities have within the grand scheme of things, all conspire to let you know that you're not in the proverbial Kansas anymore. Some of the obvious name changes for the sake of appearing different do grate a little. Kenda are obviously halflings, Sylvanesti are high elves, and so on, when sitting alongside standard names for goblins, but it does add some flavour. The real gem here, though, is the history. This is well defined, and each era of Ansalon's past builds on the last. It feels more real in some ways to the list of isolated events that often comprises the historical background for gaming worlds. Whether this could be called a feature or not, it does have to be recognised that, with DragonLance, a more narrative form of role-playing adventure did come to popularity, which has largely remained with us to this day. The virtual story railroads that are commonly found in the 5th edition adventures all owe their existence to those 14 modules of 84 to 86. The core story of the world, the War of the Lance, is by far not the only story that could be told, as proven by some of the adventures and plenty of the novels. In fact, such is the focus of a lot of the game source material on the war, that plenty of gaps exist within the setting for enterprising dungeon masters to pick up and form their own campaign, geographically and chronologically. It is a shame that over the years, Ansalon and Krynn in general have found it difficult to escape the War of the Lance. In many ways, this can be seen as a blessing. If a sweeping epic set against the backdrop of an all-encompassing war is your thing, then the War of the Lance period of Ansalon is probably perfect for you. If you like settings with meddlesome gods and high politics, then the post-war Ansalon could be for you, as could the period leading up to the disappearance of the gods. That itself leads into the War of the Lance. On that, a brief explanation may be necessary for those that don't know the DragonLance world too well. In brief, the equivalent of Ansalon's Pope got too big for his boots and made the gods cross. For their part, the entire city in which said papal-like figure dwelt, and a good chunk of the land surrounding it, was subsequently annihilated by the gods, and they turned their backs on Krynn for quite some time. This meant no clerics or divine magic, no magical healing, and so on. This period, a period without clerics and access to cure wounds and remove disease, makes for an entirely different D&D experience than one commonly supported by the game's core, and can make for an interesting change of pace and focus if default D&D is getting a little tired for you. As for me, I like DragonLance for the novels. I devoured these as a kid, although the general writing style of, well, let's say books written by game designers, has made my interest wane over time. Not just with the DragonLance novels, but game fiction novels in general. I have used Ansalon alongside the original DragonLance modules a few times for 1st, 2nd and 3rd editions of D&D, and they have always been fun. But while I can appreciate the world and its lore and enjoy reading it, it's never caught me enough to extensively game there. And that's been my overview of the Ansalon continent, the primary continent in many ways, of the DragonLance campaign setting on the world of Krynn. So coming up, more of these, my Solo Quest stuff. We'll get into the Dream Quest episode soon, and the usual random musings and meanderings. So thank you for listening, and hope to hear you again. No, whatever I do, I don't see you. Whatever I do, I hope you listen to me again. So thank you for that, and take care.